hate to be the bearer of bad news to anyone that's listening to me that may be a liberal, that may not be a conservative, that may vote for people that are in the Democratic Party. But I got to be the one to tell you today, as of June 2017, the Democratic Party in the USA is dead. It will not come back. It cannot come back. There's nothing they can do that will enable them to regain the glory that they have once had. Now, when I say glory, I'm talking about Bill Clinton. Remember Slick Willie during those years? It was beautiful, wasn't it? It was the boom of the 90s. You had a lot of different things going on. You had the e-boom, the internet came about, a lot of innovation and technology, a lot of innovation in the way we were in our country and the way we communicated with the world happened during this time. Bill Clinton got a lot of credit for that, but I'm not quite sure he was the architect behind it. I think a lot of what Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush did before him set the groundwork for the 1990s. All he had to do was just take the keys and not crash the car. And he really did crash the car, but it was a latent effect because it wasn't until 2008 when you had the mortgage crisis happen that we saw his deregulation of the banking industry as far as it relates to loans. We saw how that happened, but I digress. During the 90s, it was a glorious time for many people. Many people loved Bill Clinton for that. And I think people thought they would be able to regain what we had in the 1990s when we elected Barack Obama, the nation's first black president. I remember it. I remember being at a party at my office. Shout out to PMG and shout out to everybody that was there. That was a beautiful moment in time for me and everyone that was there with me. I really appreciated being in that environment when we had a historical election, the first black president. Well, I don't want to go down the whole road about him being mixed, this, that, and the third. Let's just call it how society generally saw it. He's a black president. We thought maybe we'd be able to regain a lot of what we had during Slick Willie. I mean, here's a guy who's also smooth and can sing. Al Green.
So in love with you. Those guys didn't think I would do it.
It was a match made in heaven for the people of the U.S. who got tired of George W. Bush, weapons of mass destruction, all these different things that we did not like. Here we go with a nice, cool, calm and collected kind of guy that's going to be able to right the ship in the proper direction. However, the ship crashed almost immediately. They blamed it on the previous administration. But how long can you continue to blame the previous administration? You're talking about George W. Bush. I mean, we blame him. When I say we, I mean American people, not me, because I know who was responsible for what Obama did. That's Barack Obama himself. But I digress. We generally, as an American people, those of us on the left especially, we blame George W. Bush for the inaction and the failure of Barack Obama. Many Americans are not willing to assign responsibility to Barack Obama for what he did during his 8-year period of time in office as a president of the United States of America. That's really unfortunate, but there are many others in the U.S. that do not have this kind of point of view. There are many of us that say, you know what, Barack Obama didn't do a good job. He was Democratic president. And we don't really like what's going on as far as how the Democrat Party is pushing themselves forward, how they're being air quotes progressive. We don't really like what they're doing. We don't like the direction they're going. And I think, well, I know, I'm not going to say I think, I know that's most certainly going to cost them any election in the future on any kind of grand scale. Now, when I say any election in the future or any kind of grand scale, I'm referring to really important elections. You're talking about the president, right? You're not going to be able to get to office anymore. Maybe you'll be able to continue to have your enclaves of the country that are extremely liberal. You're talking about San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, etc. These big urban sprawling cities with a lot of liberal people compacted in them, Washington, D.C. and the metro area, of course. Outside of these big metropolitan areas, Democrats will not be able to spread their message. They will not be able to win anything anymore. And the reason is because people in the flyover states, the states you forget about, my original hometown of Rand University, West Virginia, my state of West Virginia, We get looked over. We're a small state, only about 1.5 million people in the entire state, only about 30,000 in the biggest city of Charleston. We get looked over as being not really important, as a state that doesn't really matter. There's all kind of jokes about you're your own uncle, this, that, and the third. But we are a proud people all over the U.S., not just in West Virginia, but everywhere. Every flyover state, Montana, Nebraska, Iowa, Utah. There's all kind of states that have pride in who they are. And the Deep South that always gets looked over and joked about, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, etc. Those states and those people will be the ones who decide the next election because they are spread out. They take up most of the real estate in the U.S. It's not like going to these big cities where all the people are pretty much stuffed into one pocket, one big, massive mess of people. 10 million people in one county in Los Angeles. That's not how it is in the rest of the country. So we, those of us in the flyover states, we're going to be the ones that decide the next election. And we don't like what the Democratic Party is doing. We don't like the constant protests, the violent protests, the violence. We're talking about James Hodgkinson, who went out there and shot a bunch of Republicans trying to kill as many as he could. He had a hit list on them. We don't like stuff like that. We don't like the Black Lives Matter marches that goes out there and preaches hatred and violence towards police. We don't like what happened in Dallas, Texas, where you had a bunch of police officers that were gunned down by somebody that was radicalized by the Black Lives Matter rhetoric. We don't like people trying to bring refugees over here and stuffing them in our states. Many people that are so loving and tree hugging and want to save the world do not want to have these refugees come live in their neighborhood, let alone in their house. But they'll stuff them right in our own backyards in the flyover states. We're not necessarily anti-LGBT, but we're not really a fan of the constant forcing it into our faces. We're not a fan of men being nude around children. We're not a fan of little boys dressing as girls, dancing around. We're not a fan of things like this that go against our core values. We're not for the Planned Parenthood cabal being celebrated as some kind of pillar of virtue. We're not for all these things that violate our religion, that violate our way of life, things that they, when I say they, I mean those on the left, think are acceptable and should be looked at as primary ways of being. We look at as being very deplorable, to take a word from Miss Hillary Clinton herself, who we also don't like and who the left tried to hitch their wagon up to in a failing effort in the 2016 election. We don't appreciate that anymore. So we're going to go vote against it. Now, I've had many people ask me, what can the Democratic Party do to reverse the trend? What can they do to get people back on their side? How can they win back the public? How can they win back the hearts and the minds of many? And the answer is nothing. All they can do is what they have done. Their whole brand, especially over the past few years, especially during Barack Obama, has been about identity politics. It's been about racial inclusion. It's been about LGBT acceptance. It's been about all of these things that people don't really like that are in the flyover states that I've mentioned before. And you have to ask yourself, how can they appeal to us if that's going to be their message? They can't roll back their message, and that'd be the only way that they're able to appeal to us, because the average person all throughout the United States, it doesn't matter if you're middle America, big city or whatever, the average person is pretty much a centrist, right? But in order to reach out to the centrist, you can't be so radical. You can't be talking about LGBT stuff to the point where you're saying 8-year-old boys and girls can identify as a different gender than their birth, 59 genders and stuff like that. Really kind of crazy stuff. We're not interested in that. So how are you going to come to us with that message? But see, like I said, they can't roll back because that is what they've built their brand on. If they roll back, then they're going to not be able to retain those that they gained with that message. That's a lot of people. What if one day you had Barack Obama come on TV and say, you know what, gay marriage is wrong. It's only 2 genders. Like, do you know the kind of damage that would do to the Democratic Party? They would probably flock to Bernie Sanders if he decided to become independent. Now, I don't want to talk about his transgressions with his wife and all that kind of stuff like that, so I'm going to digress, but you understand what I mean. They would try to find some kind of happy medium that is still kind of along the lines of what they think is acceptable when you're talking about, air quotes, progressive values. But see, that will not help the Democratic Party at all. All it's going to do is fracture it even more than what it is right now, because it is fractured. Oh yes, there are many in the Democratic Party that don't like what the radical people that are outspoken, the transgender, third wave feminist, Muslim, hedonist, drug addict, heroin pushing, weed smoking. They don't like that kind of brand. But on the other end, you got people that don't like the more conservative Democrats, the more blue dog JFK Democrats. They don't like that. So there's a fracture in the Democratic Party. Now, some would say there's a fracture in the Republican Party as well. I don't really see it. I see the fracture more in the Democratic Party. And it's pretty obvious what's going on. You see at these rallies, you got Antifa. Sometimes they even fight some people that are on the left. You got them basically eating their own. Anytime somebody does something on the left that's not really aligned with what the extremists want to do, then they get thrown under the bus. They pretty much get what they call canceled, all kind of stuff like that. I mean, I've seen them people on the left talk about civil rights icons like Jim Brown in a negative way. And Jim Brown was somebody that will most certainly be on your side as a air quotes progressive. He was somebody that was actually in the front lines fighting for what the Democrats say that they are about. When I say they say that they are about, the civil rights era was more supported by the Republicans, not the Democrats. The Democrats hijacked it for their own purposes to be able to get money and to be able to get votes, just like LBJ said. Why those niggas voting Democrat for 200 years? And it seems as if he was right. For the past 50 years, we've been voting Democrat pretty much nonstop, without any kind of question, without any kind of reserve. Even with the majority of the black vote, you're not going to be able to sustain yourself in a national election. You got to ask yourself this question. In the election, national, for the president, who are you going to be able to get to actually run that has a chance against Donald Trump and or Mike Pence? Who's going to be able to run? Who, Kamala Harris? I mean, Kamala Harris is somebody that the left is not even all the way sure of. They're kind of skeptical about her. So how is she going to be the person that carries the torch? How is she going to be the person that resurrects the Democratic Party in a national way? You're talking about Cory Booker. Cory Booker is a strange looking guy. He's not smooth. He can barely talk. Barack Obama is in the past. He's not coming back. There's no way you can make Cory Booker into Barack Obama. He does not have that smooth swagger that Obama had. He does not have a wife and kids. People will question his sexuality, even though people on the left say they're about LGBT stuff. There'll still be some questions there. It's like, what's wrong with this guy? Is he in the closet? Is he out the closet? What's going on? There'll be some questions about him. They have nobody that can really fight against us in a national way. And then also, we're talking about Donald Trump being in office right now. In the prime time in history, when you're talking about the Supreme Court justices becoming very old, you're talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg at 84 years old, and you're talking about Stephen Breyer at 78, almost 79 years old, two liberal justices who will be replaced under Trump, and you already have a 5-4 split right now in favor of conservatives, so it can go to a 7-2 split when Trump is done after 4 years or 2 terms of 4 years, 8 years total. So how can any Democrats do anything when you got the deck stacked against them in that kind of way? The Supreme Court is going to be against them. The presidency is going to be against them. They don't have anybody that can run. And their message is not something that people want to have. All they can do to be able to gain more followers is to double down on it, because if they don't double down, they're going to lose people. And you're talking about the midterm elections. How are they going to win that? We've already seen all kind of defeats during the midterm elections. You're talking about Jon Ossoff, the very embarrassing defeat. He basically set $23 million, which is a record for a House seat. He set $23 million on fire, right, to try and flip a seat that had been held by Republicans for a very long time. I mean, you're talking about Newt Gingrich at one point held that seat. Tom Price held it for about 12 to 13 years. It was a shot in the dark for him to be able to get that seat, even with all kind of money from California, Chicago, New York, etc., the big liberal strongholds, you see. And you had the same thing happen in Montana. So you're not going to be able to flip the Republican seats. We have the House and the Senate and the White House and the Supreme Court. So what can the Democrats really do? Just by statistics, they're done, and by ideology, they're also done. So I say today, rest in peace, the Democratic Party. You had a good run. I'm going to go to your funeral. I'm going to look sharp. I don't want to look really ridiculous and crazy like a bum at your funeral. I want to look nice because, you know, when they take pictures, I want to be in the picture and I want it to be historic. I want it to be put in the museum because the Democratic Party, they had a very deep history, you know, very deep, and it should be remembered and not forgotten. You're talking about slavery. They were for that. The first president who freed the slaves was a Republican by the name of Abraham Lincoln, and somebody that either was a Democrat or affiliated with the Democrats killed him for that, right? And then you had the KKK, the enforcement arm of the Democratic Party. Let's not forget about that. Let's not forget about Jim Crow laws that the Democrats enacted. Let's not forget about minimum wage laws that the Democrats enacted to keep black folks from coming up north and taking white jobs away from young white men, right? Let's talk about the 1960s and civil rights, how they were against more civil rights than the Republicans were for. Let's talk about how you had the situation going down in Alabama with George Wallace trying to keep blacks out of white schools. That was a Democrat as well. Let's talk about all the cities that are ran by Democrats. Talk about Flint, Michigan, and the water crisis spurred on by all Democrats. Let's talk about Detroit and all the decay that's been spurred on in that city, all fueled by Democrats. Let's talk about all these places all over the country that have been ran by Democrats for the past 50 years that have seen nothing but urban decay, straight decline. In the white areas, they look very good, like Chicago. The white areas are beautiful, but the black areas are like plantations, violent plantations, just like it was in the past from the Democratic Party. So that's pretty much all I got to say about it. Pay your respects to the Democratic Party in the box below. And if you like what you heard, please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. Peace.